In the early hours of December 1st, 1948, a man was found lying on a quiet Australian beach. At first glance, he looked like someone who had simply fallen asleep. His head rested against a seawall. His legs were crossed. One arm lay gently beside him. But something about the scene immediately unsettled investigators. The man had no identification. Every label had been carefully cut from his clothing, and hidden in a tiny pocket sewn into his trousers was a scrap of paper containing two mysterious words: Tamám Shud. A phrase meaning, "It is finished." The scene stumped investigators, but they would soon discover that this cryptic message was only the beginning of one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. This is the story of the Somerton Man. Hello, I'm Ellie Calderwin. In the late 1940s, Adelaide was known as one of the quietest cities in Australia. It was a place of wide streets, tidy homes, and a calm rhythm of life that felt far removed from the turmoil the world had just endured. Only 3 years earlier, the Second World War had ended. Soldiers were returning home. Families were rebuilding their lives. And for many Australians, the future finally seemed peaceful again. Adelaide sits along the southern coastline of the continent, where the dry Australian landscape meets the vast waters of Gulf St. Vincent. Stretching along this coastline are miles of sandy beaches, and one of the most tranquil among them is Somerton Beach. In the 1940s, Somerton was not a busy tourist destination. It was a quiet seaside suburb where locals escaped the summer heat by spending time on the beach. On warm evenings, people would gather along the promenade overlooking the water. Couples walked slowly along the sand as the sky faded from gold to deep violet. Children chased waves along the shoreline, while the scent of salt water drifted inland. It was the kind of place where little ever seemed to happen. The biggest events, most evenings, were the arrival of the sunset and the gentle crash of waves along the beach. But on the morning of December 1st, 1948, locals made an unsettling discovery. Lying against the sea wall, just a few feet from the quiet stretch of sand, was a man no one seemed to know. He was dressed far too formally for the beach, lying still, dead. And no one could have imagined the strange chain of clues that would soon follow. On the evening of November 30th, 1948, Somerton Beach was quiet. As the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, the last of the evening walkers began heading home. At around 7 p.m, a couple strolling along the promenade noticed a man sitting against the sea wall. He was dressed in a neat suit, leaning back with his legs stretched out in front of him. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. Later that night, around 7:30 p.m, another couple passed by the same spot. The man was still there, but this time, something about him caught their attention. The man appeared to raise his right arm briefly, as if attempting to light a cigarette or brush away an insect. Then, his arm dropped back down to the ground. The couple assumed he had fallen asleep in a drunken stupor and walked on. They did not realize that that small movement might have been the last time the man ever moved. Hours passed. The beach grew silent. The tide rolled in and out beneath the moonlight. And the man remained exactly where he was. At dawn on December 1st, early risers began arriving at the beach. Among them was a man walking along the sand with his horse. As he approached the sea wall, he noticed the man lying in the same position the couples had seen him the night before. But now, something was wrong. The man was completely still. Flies had begun to gather around him. The witness moved closer to get a good look. The stranger's head rested awkwardly against the sea wall. His legs were crossed neatly at the ankles. His right arm lay extended along the ground. His left hand rested loosely on his chest. He looked strangely composed, almost as if he had laid down intentionally. But when the witness leaned closer to get a better look at him, it became clear that the man was dead. The authorities were called immediately. When the police arrived at Somerton Beach that morning, they expected a straightforward case. Perhaps a man who had collapsed during a late-night walk. But as investigators began examining the body, they noticed details that didn't make sense. The man was dressed far too formally for the beach. He wore a pressed brown suit, a tie, polished shoes, and clean socks. Even more unusual, it had been a warm night. Most people visiting the beach would have worn light summer clothing. Yet this man was dressed as though he had just stepped out of a business meeting. In a bid to identify him, the police searched his pockets, and what they found only deepened their confusion. There was a bus ticket, a half-used packet of chewing gum, a comb, matches, and a cigarette packet containing cigarettes of a different brand than the box itself. But something important was missing, something investigators always expect to find on a person. Identification. There was no wallet, no driver's license, no papers, nothing to indicate who this man was. At first, this seemed strange, but the truly disturbing discoveries would come later. Because when police examined his clothing more closely, they realized something extraordinary. Every single identifying label on his clothing had been carefully removed. His jacket, his trousers, his tie, even his underwear. It was as though someone had deliberately erased the man's identity, and even the brands of the clothes he wore before he died. And this was only just the beginning. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle, no indication of how he had died. If the man had not been injured, what could have caused his death? The body was removed from Somerton Beach and transported to the city morgue in Adelaide. There, doctors began the post-mortem examination. At first glance, the man appeared to be in excellent physical condition. He was believed to be between 40 and 45 years old, standing about 5 feet 11 inches tall. His build was athletic, with broad shoulders and strong legs. His fingernails were clean and carefully trimmed. His hair had been neatly cut. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested poverty or neglect. In fact, if anything, the man looked like someone accustomed to a tidy, professional life. But when the doctors began the internal examination, they noticed several unusual abnormalities. The man's spleen was significantly enlarged, far larger than what doctors would normally expect. His liver was congested with blood. His stomach contained partially digested food, suggesting he had eaten several hours before his death. Investigators would later determine that his final meal likely consisted of a pasty, a common meat pastry sold throughout Adelaide at the time. That the most puzzling thing was what the doctors did not find. There were no clear signs of natural disease, no heart damage, no brain hemorrhage, nothing that would clearly explain a sudden death. Because the internal findings were so unusual, doctors began to suspect that the man might have been poisoned. After all, some poisons can cause death without leaving obvious traces in the body. These substances can shut down the nervous system quickly while leaving little evidence behind. Toxicology tests were conducted, but the results were inconclusive. No poison could be definitively identified. Still, several doctors involved in the case quietly believed poisoning was the most likely explanation. If that theory were correct, it raised an even more disturbing question. Who had poisoned him, and why? As the autopsy concluded, investigators were scratching their heads. The body lay in the morgue, completely unidentified. A well-dressed stranger with no name, no documents, and no clear cause of death. But investigators were about to discover something that would turn the case from a baffling death into one of the strangest mysteries in modern history. Because hidden inside the man's clothing was a clue so strange, it would haunt investigators for decades. Weeks after the man's body was discovered, investigators discovered a tiny pocket that had been sewn into his trousers, one that had gone unnoticed during the initial investigation and the autopsy. Inside it was a tightly rolled, tiny piece of paper, bearing two cryptic words: Tamám Shud, a Persian phrase that means ended or finished. Police soon discovered the page had been torn from the final page of a rare book of poetry called the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. The phrase, Tamám Shud, appears at the very end of the book, almost like a final line closing the story. To investigators, it raised an unsettling possibility and many questions. Was this message meant to be a farewell, a final statement, or was it a clue? Where had the book come from? And why would someone carry such a cryptic message hidden inside a secret pocket in their clothing? For months, police searched for a copy of the Rubáiyát with the final page missing. They announced the discovery publicly, hoping someone might recognize it. Then, one day, a man from Adelaide contacted the authorities. He told the investigators that shortly after the Somerton Man was discovered, he had found a strange book in the back seat of his car. The car had been parked not far from Somerton Beach. At the time, he had assumed someone had accidentally left it behind. That after hearing about the Tamám Shud note in the news, he checked the book more closely. It was indeed a copy of the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám, and the final page had indeed been torn out. Investigators immediately realized that the torn page matched the scrap of paper found in the hidden pocket of the dead man's trousers. At last, it seemed they had found the book connected to the mystery. But opening the book only revealed even more disturbing clues. Inside the back cover of the book, investigators noticed something faint. Written lightly in pencil were several lines of letters. They appeared random, almost meaningless. They formed no recognizable words. They didn't match any known shorthand, and they didn't resemble any obvious cipher. Yet the arrangement suggested it was not random. Someone had written it deliberately. Experts were brought in, code specialists, military intelligence officers, even professional cryptographers. They spent years attempting to break the code, but none of them succeeded. To this day, the meaning of those letters remains unknown. Investigators also noticed something else written inside the book: a phone number. When police traced it, they discovered it belonged to a young nurse who lived only a few streets away from Somerton Beach. When officers visited her home, her reaction piqued their suspicion. At first, she denied knowing the dead man. But when investigators showed her a plaster cast of his face, taken after his death, she seemed visibly shaken. For a moment, it looked as though she might faint, but she maintained that she had never met him. She did admit one curious detail. Years earlier, she had owned a copy of the Rubáiyát, and she had given it to a man she knew during the war. But she insisted that man was someone entirely different. Whether the nurse truly did not know the Somerton Man, or was hiding something, has never been proven. This case is one of the strangest cases Australia has ever had. A well-dressed man with no identity, every clothing label removed, a hidden pocket containing a cryptic message, a book filled with an unsolved code, and a witness who may have known more than she was willing to say. Investigators began to consider a theory that sounded almost unbelievable. What if the Somerton Man had been involved in espionage? The world was entering the early years of the Cold War. Adelaide was home to military facilities and sensitive research projects. A coded message, a mysterious stranger, a connection to a local nurse. To some investigators, the pieces began to resemble the outline of a spy story. But without a name and without a decoded message, the truth remained hidden. Until this day, it still is. For more than 70 years now, the identity of the Somerton Man remains unknown. No missing person reports match his description. His fingerprints do not match any records. It is as if the man had simply appeared and vanished from history. Even today, the coded message found in the book remains unsolved, and the meaning behind those final words, Tamám Shud, continues to haunt the investigators who worked on the case. Because somewhere in those letters, and somewhere in that scrap of paper, may lie the answer to one of the strangest mysteries ever recorded. And perhaps the true identity of the man who died on Somerton Beach. If you have enjoyed this story, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. I am Ellie Calderwin, and this is Eerie Stories.